Toronto used to build a lot of apartment buildings, and this chart proves it. Hundreds of thousands of units were constructed between 1960 and 1979, but the number of new apartments began to slow down in the mid-70s, and by the late 90s, that slow trickle came to a grinding halt. But here's what was being built: condos. At first, only a few, but then lots and lots and lots of them. So why did Toronto go from a powerhouse of new rental development to a sea of condominiums, and what does that mean for renters today? Toronto's golden era of apartment buildings was the 1960s. Demand was high thanks to baby boomers.
Those babies are now 18, 19, 20. They're leaving the parents' home.
And builders were getting extra encouragement from the government.
So almost all rental housing built in Canada from 1945 to the end of the programs in 1984, actually, was subsidized. Lots of people don't realize that.
We had a very, very favorable tax system that gave significant tax advantages to developers of rental housing. So you basically had an industry that was keen to build, people that were keen to providing the demand.
That combination of lots of demand plus government incentives meant that between 1960 and 1979, more than 220,000 rental units were built in the GTA. Plus, supply was also coming from social housing. Now, that's housing built for low-income renters with government funding.
Eventually, over 300 low-cost homes will cover this area.
And we were building about 20,000 social housing units annually for 3 decades, 1965 to roughly 1995. So that was a lot of supply.
So, if you were a renter in the 1960s and 70s, things were good. But in the 80s and 90s, that started to change. In the mid-70s and early 80s, tax breaks for builders went away, and so did those modest subsidies, all during a time when it was costing more to build. And because life was getting expensive for everyone, the federal government asked provinces to adopt rent control measures, which many of them did.
So basically now you've suppressed the increase in rents at a time when costs are going up. So you kind of get this mismatch between the cost of building and the revenues you're going to generate in the long run, downstream.
Oh, and remember those baby boomers? They were getting older, starting families, and they wanted to trade apartment living for white picket fences.
So you had a bit of weakening demand. So you had higher costs, unfavorable environment for taxes, and that was kind of the death knell in the rental coffin.
But while rental construction was slowing down, condos were picking up. Now there was a market of people who wanted to own apartments.
The condo product, even though the legislation was created in 1969, it took a while for it to sort of be accepted in the marketplace, and the idea of buying an apartment versus buying a house, which people had traditionally been used to. So we really didn't sort of see a significant growth in condominium construction really until the 1990s.
Condo buildings took off and rental building trickled to a halt. But that switch, it didn't change much for renters, at least not right away. That's in part because in the 90s and early 2000s, lots of people were becoming homeowners. They were leaving the rental market, which made space for other renters to come in.
We had this offsetting release of pressure on the rental market by ability to access the homeownership market.
And eventually, condos also started to feed into the rental market too, with more investors buying units and putting them up for rent.
About 90% of new rental supply in the GTA comes from the condo sector. We've been kind of spoiled by the fact that we've had so much demand from investors buying condos and renting them out in the GTA that there wasn't really a whole lot of attention paid to the fact that we haven't been building purpose-built rentals in the GTA for really 40 or 50 years.
Fast forward to today, and Toronto is suddenly in dire need of more rental buildings.
So I think what we really need is just a drastic, substantial, huge increase in purpose-built rental being constructed.
We're projecting rental demand in the GTA to increase by over 300,000 units in the next 10 years. It's pretty clear we need to do something to ramp up that level of construction and do it now.
So why has that changed? Why does it all of a sudden feel like we need more rentals in Toronto? Well, for one, we stopped building social housing.
In the late 80s, early 90s, both the federal and provincial levels of government got out of the housing business, and where this, burden of building and maintaining the existing stock really sort of fell on municipalities without any, revenue tools to actually to do that.
Also, owning a home is now completely out of reach for many. So in the past, where you would have a steady number of renters becoming homeowners, more of them are staying in the rental market. Now combine that with more people moving to Toronto, and the need for rentals is at an all-time high.
Right now, for the foreseeable future, it's a terrible moment.
If you were to finish a sentence for us, renting in Toronto is
A nightmare.
Yeah, a nightmare.
So if Torontonians need rentals now more than ever, how come developers aren't jumping at the chance to capitalize on that demand? Well, that could be because right now the cost to build is too high.
So you can address the problem on the cost side by trying to create housing that's not as expensive, but it's impossible to build for less than what it costs to build, and therefore your minimum rents that you have to set have to cover the costs of operating the building, keeping the lights on, heating the units, and paying the mortgage. So there is a floor to which rents can actually come down.
For private developers, it only makes sense to build if they can make their money back, and that means charging high rents. But what happens when most people just can't afford those rents?
The supply and demand isn't operating properly. It hasn't operated on the rental side for many decades. The market responds to what? Market demand. Not just demand, right? It has to be people with enough money. We now have a society and a city with more and more households without enough money to generate what's called effective market demand.
Effective market demand, that means enough people with enough money to justify building more housing. So if supply and demand is broken, what can fix the rental market?
I think the writing has been on the wall for years, and that is that the government needs to get back into the housing business, or the government needs to, provide greater funding to nonprofit entities and community land trusts to where we're building more non-market housing.
The government steps in when there's a market failure. We did that with our healthcare system. We sorted that one out so that people are not excluded from the healthcare system because of income. But we haven't done that for the housing system.
We need public housing, affordable housing, because all of the building that we're talking about, a lot of people can't afford it. Right here in this city, we have 90,000 households waiting for affordable housing on a subsidized housing list. Those are the kind of housing we really need desperately, because for 2 decades we haven't built any public housing.
We absolutely need to focus on purpose-built rental housing that is affordable, and the market will never build that. So the longer we wait for the market to deliver, the more of a crisis this is going to be.